Rick Ross just got caught in the loudest lie of his entire career, and what leaked out of Billboard this week is so bad that even the people who spent 20 years building the myth are quietly backing away from the boat. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not have a PR team. Numbers do not care how big the chain is or how loud the intro was. And the numbers that just dropped on Rick Ross are the kind of numbers that end eras, reshape legacies, and force an entire generation of rappers to stare at a mirror none of them wanted to see. Let me put this in front of you before anybody in the boat brigade tries to spin it into something it isn't. Rick Ross, the self-anointed biggest boss, the man who has been sitting across from every podcast microphone in America telling the world that his catalog is untouchable and his empire is on fire, just watched his brand new album set in Stoneland at number 45 on the Billboard 200 with a first week count of 17,200 units. That is not a typo. 17,200 in a week. For a man with 20 plus features stapled to the track list. For a man who spent the last month insulting Drake, insulting 50 Cent, insulting the algorithm, and insulting the audience that used to fill his arenas without being asked twice. Sit with that number for a second, because that number is the entire story. And listen, I want to be fair to Ross here, because fair is fair. I am not one of these commentators who is going to bury a legacy artist over one bad week. But we have to be honest about what just happened, because Rick Ross has been walking around for years telling anybody who would listen that he is on the same tier as the biggest movers in the culture. He said it on Patrick Bet-David. He said it at his own press stops. He said it on his own social pages. He said it in every interview where the host was too polite to push back. And now the receipts have arrived, and the receipts do not match the speech. The mask just slid off, and it slid off in front of everybody. Every single fan who was quietly wondering. Every single competitor who was patiently waiting. Every single label executive who had a spreadsheet open. All of them saw the same number at the same time, and none of them can unsee it. You have to understand the mechanics of what a 17,000 unit week actually is in the current industry landscape. To sell 17,000 album equivalent units, when the streaming numbers are also averaging under 1.5 million a day, means the project has almost no radio pull, almost no cultural conversation, and almost no active fan momentum outside of the diehards. Rick Ross is a brand. Rick Ross is a story. Rick Ross is a persona. But a brand without a current hit is a museum, not a movement. And Rick Ross has not had a hit that mattered on radio in almost 7 years. That is the real story hiding underneath the sales collapse, and that is the story the Miami Mirage machine does not want anyone saying out loud. Because once the audience says it out loud, the illusion is finished, and the illusion is what pays for the boat, the chains, the cigars, the cameras, and the crew. Now, before we go any deeper into this, I want to be honest with you about my own read. I did not expect Ross to do 50,000. I did not expect him to do 40. Anybody who has been paying honest attention to Rick Ross's commercial arc knew this album was going to land somewhere between 20 and 30 at best. So the shock is not that he flopped. The shock is how he flopped. Because 17,000 is under the floor. 17,000 is under what a mid-tier viral rapper does. 17,000 is under what a debut artist with a TikTok single does. 17,000 is under what an insane SoundCloud kid pulls when a single clip goes moderately viral on a Tuesday afternoon. And when Rick Ross puts his entire brand, his entire boss identity, his entire catalog owner narrative on the line for a first week release, that number is not just disappointing. That number is a verdict, and the jury did not even need to deliberate. And that is where 50 Cent comes in. Because if there is one man on earth who is waiting for this exact moment with a full plate of popcorn and a fully charged phone, his name is Curtis Jackson. Days before the tracking numbers even came out, 50 Cent was already on Instagram telling anyone who would listen that Rick Ross was cooked. He said the boat sank. He said the album went wood. He said, in that clean, surgical, 20-year veteran troll voice of his, that nobody was checking for that project. And then, when the actual number arrived, 50 Cent posted a screenshot with the caption that Rick Ross had gotten away with the con for a long time, but the con was finally over. 20 features on the album. Under 10,000 pure copies. The jig, as 50 called it in his own words, was up. And 50 Cent, who has made an entire second career out of turning other rappers' bad days into content, was not about to let this one pass without a full media tour. Now, some of you are going to say 50 Cent is being petty. Some of you are going to say Curtis is bored. Some of you are going to say the two of them have been beefing for so long that none of it matters anymore. But here is what people are missing. The reason 50 Cent's trolling is landing this time is because the numbers back him up. When 50 was clowning Ross 5 years ago, Ross had platinum plaques on the wall to answer back with. When 50 was clowning Ross 10 years ago, Ross had a top 5 album to fire back at him. When 50 was clowning Ross 15 years ago, Ross had Aston Martin Music and Hustlin' and MC Hammer and BMF all playing simultaneously on every radio station in America. But now Rick Ross has nothing to hold up. He has an album at 45 on the Billboard 200, an empty tour venue in Miami, and a tracklist that even his most loyal fans are quietly deleting from their playlists after 2 spins. There is no counterpunch available. There is no scoreboard to point at. There is just a widening silence where the wins used to be. And the tour situation is where it goes from bad to catastrophic. Because right after Rick Ross rolled out Setitinstone, his team also rolled out a tour, and the tour map that leaked online is a horror movie. Take a look at the Miami stop, in Ross's own hometown, in Ross's own city, in the city where his entire persona is anchored. The seat map showed rows and rows of green dots, and if you know anything about how ticketing platforms work, green means unsold. There were more green dots than there were purchased seats. In Miami. In Rick Ross's Miami. His name is literally in the geography of the state, and he cannot sell his own hometown venue. That is not a slow-selling tour. That is a rejection. That is the city that made him standing at a bus stop and refusing to get on the bus that has his own face painted on the side of it. That is what happens when the persona has drifted so far away from the community that fed it that even the community stops pretending. And it got worse. Because Rick Ross's team, in an attempt to save the tour, started running discount promotions on the tickets themselves. Buy one, get one 50% off. On a Rick Ross world tour. Circle it back to the era just 3 albums ago, when Rick Ross was headlining arenas, and try to imagine any version of that Ross running a 2-for-1 clearance sale on his own name. It would have been unthinkable. It would have been insulting. And yet here we are, and here Ross is, chain-linked cheerleaders online trying to spin the discount as some kind of fan appreciation gesture, when everybody with functional eyes can see exactly what it is. It is a fire sale. The boat did not sink metaphorically. The boat is being auctioned off row by row. Anybody who has ever worked promotion inside a venue can tell you what a 2-for-1 on a headline tour means. It means the promoter got scared. It means the projections were terrifying. It means somebody in a boardroom decided that half revenue at full capacity was better than full revenue at half capacity, and that decision only gets made when the numbers are truly grim. And then, right in the middle of the freefall, Rick Ross went on live and said the quiet part out loud, and this is where the story goes from a commercial story to a psychological one. Because when Ross was asked how he felt about what 50 Cent had said about him, Rick Ross did not laugh it off. Rick Ross did not deflect. Rick Ross did not do what a confident, cash-heavy mogul would do, which is nothing at all. Rick Ross instead pivoted immediately to Shreveport, Louisiana, and to 50 Cent's much-discussed film studio venture in that city. Ross accused Curtis of borrowing money from the people of Shreveport, of never paying it back, and of stealing from the community while pretending to build Hollywood in Louisiana. He called him Curtis, he called him a fraud, and he demanded that Curtis give the people their money back. He said it with heat. He said it with volume. He said it like a man who had been waiting to say it for months. And that is precisely why the pivot felt like a confession dressed in a costume. Now, that pivot is very interesting. Because when a man is winning, he does not need to pivot. When a man is winning, he can simply post his sales numbers, post his sold-out venues, and let the arithmetic do the talking. Rick Ross did not have arithmetic on his side. Rick Ross had a Shreveport talking point, and it landed with the sound of a man scrambling for a life raft on a boat that had already taken on too much water. And the second Rick Ross uttered Shreveport, the internet lit up, because half the internet had never heard of the story, and half the internet had been waiting for somebody to bring it up on this exact stage. So the Shreveport clap did land as a distraction, but distractions do not sell albums. Distractions do not fill arenas. Distractions do not answer the question of why 17,000 is the number that got typed onto the billboard sheet next to Rick Ross's name. Distraction is the drug of the losing side, and Rick Ross reached for the strongest dose he had. And listen, I am not here to litigate what did or did not happen in Shreveport. That is a separate legal and civic conversation, and it involves incentives, land grants, tax credits, municipal filings, and city council votes that neither Ross nor his critics have laid out in full public view. What I am here to litigate is the moment. And the moment tells us that Rick Ross, in the biggest sales week of his post-2020 career, chose to defend himself by attacking the location of another man's business venture rather than defending the product he had just put out. That is a tell. That is the biggest tell in the entire conversation. Because when the product is strong, the artist defends the product. When the product is weak, the artist attacks the critic's zip code. Every experienced media consumer knows the difference between those two responses on instinct, even if they cannot put it into words. Because here is what carrying water for the boss really looks like when it collapses. Ross went live again the very same night. He put on the shades. He put on the smile. He lit the cigar. He put on his best boss voice, the one he has been rehearsing since 2006, and he told the camera that Set in Stone was going to be the album of the year. He said it flat. He said it with a straight face. He said he still owned his catalog. He said he was shooting videos to every single track. He said Mahogany Caskets, the T.I. record, was going to be, in his words, on fire. He mentioned Ring Around the Rosie with Lucci. He mentioned a conversation with Nick Cannon. He mentioned Luke Belair toasts for everybody who bought the album. He mentioned the 305 like a lifeline. And he ended the whole speech by saying that whatever the final numbers were, he was going to throw a party for them. Read that last sentence back to yourself and let it register. Rick Ross said he is going to throw a party for whatever his final numbers are. That is not a boss line. That is not confidence. That is the sound a man makes when he knows the number is small, and he is trying to bake the shame into a celebration before the shame arrives on its own. Any man who has ever actually pulled a strong opening week does not have to promise a party for the numbers, because the numbers throw their own party. Aston Martin Music threw its own party. Hustlin' threw its own party. Deeper Than Rap threw its own party. Rich Forever threw its own party. Teflon Don threw its own party. Set in Stone, based on what we are watching in real time, is going to have to buy its own cake, hire its own DJ, print its own invitations, and rent its own venue at a discount. And Rick Ross, if he is being honest with himself in the mirror, already knows that. And this is what the MMG Megaphone Squad does not want to say out loud. Rick Ross has been coasting on the strength of a persona that was built in an era where the persona itself could sell records. In 2010, in 2011, in 2012, Rick Ross could put out a mixtape, sit next to Drake on a hook, drop a Meek Mill feature, and coast on that infrastructure for 2 years. But the infrastructure has crumbled. Drake is not on his hooks anymore. The DJ Khaled Anthem Factory is not printing hits at the rate it used to. Meek Mill has his own commercial issues to solve. Whale is in a different lane entirely. And Ross, without his hit guy pipeline, is exposed as what he actually is right now, which is a legacy voice looking for a lane in a genre that has already moved on to the next generation. The genre has a new center of gravity, and that center of gravity is not in Miami anymore. It is spread across Atlanta, Detroit, Memphis, and a cluster of internet subcultures that Ross was never plugged into. Now, here is where I want to be fair again, because I meant what I said earlier. I am not going to sit here and pretend Rick Ross is finished. Rick Ross is not finished. Rick Ross owns his catalog, which means the Aston Martin Music checks and the Hustlin' checks and the BMF checks are still landing in his account every single quarter for the rest of his life. That is real money. That is generational money. That is a passive income stream most rappers would build a religion around. But owning the catalog is not the same as being commercially current. And what Ross is currently trying to do is convince the audience that owning the past means dominating the present, and the audience is not buying that argument anymore. 17,000 is the sound of the audience not buying that argument. 17,000 is the receipt for a lecture nobody wanted. And you can see the panic setting and even in the way the surrounding stories are moving. Because look at what happened just hours after the tracking numbers came out. Rick Ross did not go quiet. Rick Ross did not take a strategic day off from social media. Rick Ross went into overdrive. He posted about videos being shot. He posted about the catalog. He posted about Luke Belair toasts. He posted about Nick Cannon meetings. He tagged the 305. He mentioned bots. He mentioned smoke screens. He did every single thing a rapper does when the numbers do not save him, which is to try to fill the silence with content velocity, hoping that the noise will drown out the arithmetic. And every experienced observer of the culture recognizes that pattern instantly, because we have seen it happen to a dozen artists before Ross, and we will see it happen to a dozen after. Except the arithmetic does not drown. The arithmetic just sits there on the billboard sheet, printed in plain black text, waiting for whoever wants to type it into a tweet. And every day that Rick Ross posts another glamour clip, another cigar clip, another boat clip, another chain clip, the gap between the persona and the performance widens by another notch. That is why 50 Cent's trolling is landing the way it is landing. Because 50 Cent is not fighting Ross. 50 Cent is fighting the gap. And the gap is doing most of the work for him. All 50 has to do is point at the gap. He does not even have to describe it. He just posts the screenshot and steps back, and the internet finishes the sentence. Now, before we get to what Rick Ross actually needs to do to climb back out of this hole, let me address the Drake piece of this, because Drake is the ghost in this entire conversation. Rick Ross, in interview after interview over the last 3 months, has been taking swings at Drake. He said Drake's Iceman project was horrendous. He said Drake was not what people think he is. He said Drake's fanbase was inflated. He said the numbers were bots. He said Drake was over. He said it in podcast rooms, in radio interviews, in Instagram live sessions, and in every microphone-facing environment he could find. And now, with the actual billboard sheet in hand, we can measure Rick Ross's opinion about Drake against Rick Ross's own market performance, and the comparison is embarrassing. Drake, on his lowest-performing recent album, is still moving more units in 12 hours than Ross moved in the entire first week. That is not a Drake defense. That is a Drake fact. And Rick Ross, in choosing to attack Drake at the exact moment his own sales floor was collapsing, made a strategic error that his team should have caught. Because when you are about to release a project that is going to underperform, the last thing you want to do is loudly measure yourself against the biggest commercial artist of your generation. You do not paint yourself into that comparison. You do not walk yourself into that arena. Ross walked in there anyway, and now the arena is measuring him, and the tape measure is not flattering. Somebody in Ross's inner circle should have pulled him aside 3 months ago and said, quietly and firmly, please stop. Because every insult Rick Ross threw at Drake became a scorecard Ross would eventually have to answer to. And the scorecard has now been posted, and the scorecard is not kind. And this is the point in the story where the boat brigade always shows up in the comments. So let me address them directly. Yes, Rick Ross has an incredible catalog. Yes, Rick Ross has some of the best hooks of the 2010s. Yes, Rick Ross has built one of the most iconic personas in modern rap. Yes, the voice is one of a kind. Yes, the bars are still technically sharp when he wants them to be. Nobody, and I mean nobody in this conversation, is denying any of that. But a catalog is a rearview mirror, and a rearview mirror does not drive the car forward. Rick Ross's problem is not history. Rick Ross's problem is present tense. And in the present tense, Rick Ross needs a hit, and Rick Ross does not have one. And a rapper without a current hit is a rapper waiting to be quoted in the past tense on somebody else's podcast. Which lands us right here. If Rick Ross wants to reset this arc, and I genuinely believe he can reset it, because I have watched him do it before, he needs 3 specific moves, and I am going to lay them out clearly. First, Rick Ross needs to stop dissing Drake. It is not because Drake is untouchable. It is because Drake was, for a decade, the most reliable hit manufacturing partner Rick Ross ever had. Every time Ross needed a radio smash, Drake showed up. Aston Martin Music. Stay Schemin'. Made Men. Lord knows. You only live twice. Free Spirit. That pipeline was not just a friendship. That pipeline was a business. And Rick Ross detonated that pipeline for a viral news cycle that lasted, at most, 3 weeks. That was the worst commercial trade of his career, and it will be studied in music business classrooms as an example of trading a decade of guaranteed revenue for a month of social media clicks. Second, Rick Ross needs to find a new hit guy. If Drake is off the table, and it very much seems off the table, then Ross has to identify who the current radio anchor collaborators are and get in the studio with them. That could be Jay-Z, who has been quietly working with Ross for years. That could be a Jay-Z DJ Khaled resurrection. That could be Ross reaching out to the next generation, someone in the current top 40 rotation. That could be a future collaboration, a Ghana feature, a Lotto guest verse, or a strategic hook from somebody in the R&B space who is currently charting. But somebody, and it has to be somebody with a current pulse, has to be the vocal anchor on the next single. Because if Rick Ross keeps trying to do it alone with his signature boss voice hooks, the market has already told him twice, on 2 consecutive albums, that the market is not buying. And the market does not repeat itself politely. Third, Rick Ross has to change the tone. And this is the hardest one, because tone is identity. But the boss voice, the mogul voice, the my catalog is untouchable voice, that voice is now being read by the audience as delusion instead of confidence. There is a fine line between a mogul who is winning and a man who is performing winning while losing, and Rick Ross has crossed that line publicly. What he needs to do is what Jay-Z did after Kingdom Come. What LL Cool J did after multiple sales dips. What Nas did after Nostradamus. What every legendary rapper does when the numbers stop cooperating. He needs to make the vulnerable album. He needs to make the album where he tells the audience what has actually been happening behind the sunglasses. If Rick Ross made a record like that, and structured it right, and got the right producers, that record could go platinum. Not because of the sales machine, but because the audience is waiting to see the real him, and the audience is patient, and the audience is forgiving when the artist stops lying. But we are not there yet. We are here, at 17,200, at number 45 on the Billboard 200, at a Miami tour venue full of green dots, at a live stream where the boss is promising a party for whatever the numbers turn out to be, and at a rival named Curtis Jackson who is posting about it in real time for an audience of 32 million people. That is where Rick Ross is right now. And whether Rick Ross can climb out of this depends entirely on whether Rick Ross is willing to admit the position he is actually in. Because admission is the first door. And Ross has not opened it yet. And this is why 50 Cent has an edge that nobody in the Boat Brigade wants to acknowledge. 50 Cent, whatever you think of him, has done the vulnerable pivot before. When Curtis's music career slowed down, 50 Cent went into television. Power turned into a multi-$100 million empire. G-Unit Film and Television became a real production house. BMF The Series turned into a global franchise. 50 Cent evolved. 50 Cent stopped pretending the rap career was the only career. 50 Cent rerouted. Rick Ross has businesses too. Ross has Wingstop. Ross has Bel Air. Ross has real estate. Ross has his own bourbon. But Rick Ross has not made the internal pivot that 50 Cent made, which is to stop measuring your worth by the Billboard sheet. And until Rick Ross makes that pivot, every single Tuesday when the sales numbers drop is going to feel like another public autopsy. And every Tuesday, Curtis Jackson will be there with a screenshot and a caption, because Curtis Jackson has already lived through this exact chapter and knows exactly where the pressure points are. And listen, before anybody in the comments accuses me of piling on, let me repeat what I said at the top of this entire breakdown. I like Rick Ross. I have played Rick Ross since Port of Miami. I have sat in cars, on highways, at parties, at cookouts, at cookout after parties, with Rick Ross records playing full volume, and I have never once regretted the soundtrack. Rick Ross has been part of the culture for 2 decades, and that is a genuine achievement. Very few rappers get 2 decades. Most get 5 years. Some get 10. Ross got 20, and that alone is worth respect. But there is a difference between a fan defending an artist and a fan refusing to see reality. Reality is that Rick Ross needs a reinvention, and reinvention starts with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement starts with silence. And silence, for Rick Ross right now, would be the loudest, smartest, and most powerful move he could possibly make. Now let me pull the camera back for a second, because there is a bigger story hiding underneath the Ross vs. 50 storyline, and it is a story that affects every legacy rapper in the game right now. The commercial ceiling for rappers over the age of 40 has collapsed. Not just for Rick Ross. For everybody in that tier. Meek Mill's last album did numbers that would have been unthinkable in 2015. Fabulous cannot get radio anymore. Fat Joe went to television. Jeezy went to podcasting. The game is on OnlyFans cosigns. Will has retreated to indie mode. Common has been in film. Even the biggest names in the 40-plus cohort are quietly restructuring their careers around anything except album sales. The entire cohort of 40-plus rappers is watching the streaming economy chew up their release windows and spit out numbers they never imagined seeing next to their names. And Rick Ross, whether he admits it or not, is at the front of that reckoning right now, because Rick Ross is the loudest, and the loudest one always gets measured first. That is the rule of the culture. The one with the biggest chain gets the loudest scoreboard. That is why 50 Cent's post landed. That is why the Miami tour map got screenshotted a million times. That is why the Shreveport pivot became a meme within hours. It was not just about Ross. It was about a generation of rappers looking at a mirror and not liking the reflection. And Rick Ross, in that moment, became the mirror. Every legacy rapper who watched the Ross week unfold saw their own possible future flashing in front of them, and every one of them privately asked themselves the same question. If Rick Ross can drop this low, what does my next release look like? And that question, whispered privately across 100 studios and 100 group chats, is louder than any diss track any of them will ever record. And the meta question that nobody in the Boat Brigade has been able to answer is this. If Rick Ross was really doing the numbers he claims he is doing on his side businesses, why does the album performance matter to him so much emotionally? A man who is truly cash-heavy in 6 other industries does not go on live at midnight to promise a party for whatever the album numbers turn out to be. A man who is truly at peace does not need to attack another man's Shreveport dealings on the same live stream. A man whose empire is genuinely stacked does not react to a screenshot with an hour-long tirade. Rick Ross's emotional response is telling us more about Rick Ross's actual financial state than any Forbes profile ever could. And that is the part of the story that the culture is starting to notice. Because the culture reads emotion better than any accountant reads a balance sheet. I am not saying Rick Ross is broke. I do not have his bank statements. Nobody in the comment section has his bank statements. What I am saying is that the reaction we are watching from Rick Ross this week does not match the reaction of a man who is winning. It matches the reaction of a man who needed this album to matter more than it did. And there is a specific gravity to that gap, and the audience can feel it, even if the audience cannot articulate it yet. That is what a real forensic read looks like. You watch the reaction, and you let the reaction tell you the truth. Rick Ross's reaction is telling us the truth right now. The mouth says one thing. The eyes say another. And the culture is watching both. So where does this go from here? Let me sketch the 3 scenarios in detail, because this is the strategic conversation Rick Ross's team should be having in a boardroom right now, not on Instagram Live. Scenario 1. Rick Ross doubles down. He keeps trolling Drake. He keeps swinging at Curtis. He keeps promising the album of the year. The next single underperforms. The tour continues to collapse. The features stop returning phone calls because features do not want to be attached to a losing brand. And by the end of the cycle, Rick Ross is looking at a career pivot he did not want to make into podcasting or television, humbled by the arithmetic he tried to out. This is the worst scenario, and it is also the scenario that current momentum is pointing toward. Scenario 2, Rick Ross goes silent for 90 days. No press. No live streams. No Drake shots. Number 50 shots. He disappears, works on new music, and comes back with a single that reintroduces him. That is the Jay-Z playbook. That is the LL Cool J playbook. That is the Nas playbook. That is the smart move. Because silence, in the modern content economy, is louder than volume, and mystery is a more valuable asset than access. If Rick Ross gave the internet even 90 days of not talking about him, the return would be a cultural event by default. But this requires discipline, and discipline requires humility, and humility is exactly what the boss voice was engineered to resist. Scenario 3. Rick Ross finds a hit guy fast. He calls in a big feature. He gets a record on radio. He rides that record for a summer, and the sales conversation gets rewritten. That is possible. Rick Ross has the connections and the money to make that happen. The only question is whether Rick Ross's pride will let him place that call. Because the call is not a musical decision. The call is a psychological decision. It requires Rick Ross to say to somebody in the current generation, "I need you more than you need me, and I am willing to admit it in the most public way possible." That is not a phone call the boss voice knows how to make. Because at the end of the day, this is not about music. This is about pride. And Rick Ross's pride has been the engine of his career for 20 years. Pride made Port of Miami. Pride made Rich Forever. Pride made Rick Ross the boss. Pride sold the mogul narrative to a generation that grew up watching him. But pride, when the numbers turn on you, becomes the anchor that keeps you attached to a sinking narrative. And Rick Ross, right now, has to decide which he loves more, the pride or the career, the chain or the runway, the persona or the future. And this is a decision no team member can make for him. No manager. No publicist. No producer. Only Ross. Alone. With the mirror. And here is the meta loop I want to leave you with, because we are almost at the end. If Rick Ross has flopped this badly with 20 features and a full press cycle, what does that mean for the rest of the 2010s cohort that is lined up to release albums this fall? What does that mean for Meek Mill's rollout? What does that mean for the Jeezy comeback that keeps getting teased? What does that mean for the entire Maybach music infrastructure Rick Ross built? What does that mean for every rapper whose sound is anchored in the 2010s Miami luxury blueprint? Because if the boss cannot sell 20,000 in his own first week, in his own hometown, with his own historic catalog, then the entire ecosystem around him is about to face the same reckoning. And that is not a Rick Ross problem. That is a generational problem. And it is arriving all at once, on the same calendar, at the same volume. So watch this space closely. Because within the next 30 days, we are going to see either Rick Ross's biggest comeback maneuver of the decade, or we are going to see the beginning of the retirement conversation that nobody in the culture wants to have out loud. Either way, this set in stone chapter is not just an album cycle. This is an inflection point for one of the most iconic personas modern rap has ever produced. Every fan will remember where they were when the number dropped. Every industry executive will remember what they told their bosses that morning. Every rival rapper will remember the shape of the screenshot. And Rick Ross, more than anybody, will remember the exact moment he heard the number for the first time. That memory will shape the next 10 years of his career, whether he admits it or not. And there is another layer worth noticing, because nothing in the culture happens in isolation. The Rick Ross week arrived at the same moment streaming platforms are being restructured, and the entire album release model is being questioned privately by every major label executive over dinner. Rick Ross did not just have a bad week. Rick Ross had a bad week during a bad quarter for the album format itself, and the numbers became louder than they otherwise would be because there was no favorable industry backdrop to absorb the blow. Meanwhile, 50 Cent is doing what 50 Cent always does when the temperature shifts in the culture, which is applying pressure at the exact moment the pressure will land hardest. Every 50 Cent post this week has been timed to a fresh Ross moment. Every meme has been curated. Every screenshot has been captioned like a professional publicist wrote it. Because Curtis Jackson understands the timing of the media cycle at a level almost nobody else in this generation of rappers understands it. Rick Ross is fighting a media war with 2012 tactics, and 50 Cent is fighting it with 2026 tactics. Ross is posting cigar videos. 50 Cent is posting algorithmic bait. And the feed always beats the room in the current attention economy. Now I want to hear from you directly. Do you think Rick Ross recovers from this? Do you think 50 Cent is right, that the jig is finally up? Do you think the Shreveport clapback landed, or did it prove Ross had nothing else? And who do you think Ross should call to be his next hit guy? Should Ross reach out to Jay-Z? Should Ross call up Metro Boomin and start over from scratch? Should Ross do a full pivot to the podcast lane like Fat Joe did? Or should Ross just take the 90 days off and let the culture miss him for the first time in a decade? Drop it in the comments. Be specific. Be honest. And if you made it this far, you're the reason this channel exists, and you already know what to do. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, and keep it locked. Because right after this, we are getting into a story about a certain other West Coast heavyweight whose numbers just dropped, and that story might be even wilder than the one you just heard. Because if this week taught us anything, it is that the boat everyone was riding is not the boat everyone thought it was. The mask just slid off. The tape measure is out. And the culture, the real culture, the culture that pays attention to receipts, is finally holding everybody accountable. Rick Ross included. Rick Ross first. And Rick Ross, if he is smart enough to listen, still has time to write the second act. The clock is ticking. The audience is watching. And the next move belongs entirely to Ross. The pen is in his hand. The page is blank. The camera is rolling. And the world, for one more window that will not stay open forever, is still willing to give Rick Ross a chance to answer with the only thing that ever mattered in the first place, which is a hit song big enough to make the 17,000 a footnote instead of a headline. That song exists inside him somewhere. The only question left is whether he can still find it before the door closes on its own.